Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees.
Episode 121, the fourth member of the Kelly gang. Steve Hart was once one of the most infamous bushrangers in Australia. Now he's often an afterthought, as the other Kelly, Ned Kelly, is looked upon as a hero and has been covered widely in the press. According to an article in the Evening News on the 14th of February 1879, it says, Ned Kelly is looked upon as a hero all over the northeastern district, and Steve Hart is second only in popular esteem. Steve Hart was born on the 13th of February 1859 to Richard Hart and Bridget Young. Richard Hart was born in 1817 and he was transported to Australia as an 18-year-old convict from Dublin in 1835 on the Lady Macnaghten for being a pickpocket. He was transported under the name Richard Harding, and it stated his occupation at the time of his conviction was an errand boy. His trial was on the 10th of March 1835 and he was transported for 7 years due to having prior convictions. Richard Hart's half-brother, Henry Nicholas Hart, had been transported 2 years prior. Henry had been born in 1814 and was also convicted of pickpocketing in Dublin. He was tried on the 20th of December 1832 and received 7 years transportation. He'd already done a 7-month jail term prior. Henry Hart was a stonemason and he married Elizabeth Nerney in 1843 at St Mary's in Sydney. Elizabeth's parents were both convicts from Ireland, and they had 9 children. 3 were not living by the time Nicholas died in 1865, only aged 47, and he died of typhoid. It stated that he was living at Pymont Bridge Road, Glebe, at the time of his death. And on the 17th of August 1869, so 4 years after his death, it announced the death of his daughter, Mary Ann, who was the eldest daughter of the late Mr. Nicholas Hart, dying at the residence of her mother at Pymont Bridge Road after a short but lingering illness. And on the 14th of January 1874, it announces that the widow of the late Nicholas Hart of Sydney, Elizabeth Hart, was married on the 9th of January 1874 at the Wesleyan Church in Glebe Road, Glebe, to a native of Dublin, Joseph McGuinness. It's not until 1877 in the newspaper that there is the announcement of the will of Nicholas Hart, late of Glebe near Sydney, a stonemason, and it hereby gives the proceeds of the will to be granted to John Nerney of Glebe, a shoemaker, the sole surviving executor of the will. Interestingly, that will was not bestowed to his surviving 2 children, his son or his daughter, at the time of this being processed. So back to Richard Hart, Stephen Hart's father. He earned his ticket of leave on the 26th of January 1840, and he later gained his certificate of freedom on the 18th of June 1843. And in the subsequent years, he was also joined by his sister Anne, that was also transported as a convict. Richard was employed at Gunning Station at Fish River, working for Elizabeth O'Neill, the widow of John Kennedy Hume, the brother of explorer Hamilton Hume from episode 109, who'd been murdered by the bushranger Thomas Whitten on the 20th of January 1840. The widow Hume had been left with 9 children to care for. She was pregnant with her 9th at the time of her husband's murder, and with nobody to protect them, so Richard's presence was likely very welcome. 10 years after Richard gained his ticket of leave, recently orphaned Bridget Young, aged 16, and her sister Mary, aged 21, travelled to Australia from Galway on the Thomas Arbuthnot as part of the Earl Grey Famine Orphan Scheme. They arrived in Sydney and were stationed at the Hyde Park Barracks for several weeks before travelling to Yass for work. Bridget became indentured to Mr. Smith of Mingay Station in Gundagai. One of the young women who'd accompanied Bridget all the way to Yass since their initial departure from Galway was Margaret White, who would later move to Goulburn, and she would marry Paddy Byrne. These two were the parents of the Kelly gang member Joe Byrne. Richard Hart married Bridget Badella Young on the 7th of November 1852 at Gundagai. They had a son, William, who died as an infant in Gundagai in 1852. When Elizabeth O'Neill left Gunning and took up residence at her property, Burramine, at Yarrawonga in the 1850s, it's likely that Richard travelled with her. Stephen Hart was born at the Hart property on 3 Mile Creek, Wangaratta, and he was one of 13 children. The Hart family seemed to do quite well with a 53-acre property in Wangaratta on the 3 Mile Creek and a larger 230-acre block at the foot of the Warby Ranges. When Richard died on the 5th of February 1897, he didn't leave a will, and it states Esther Williams, Thomas Hart, Rachel Lloyd and Agnes Hall, as well as Harriet O'Brien, were all the children of the said deceased and his only next of kin. Stephen Hart went to the Wangaratta Roman Catholic School till about 15 years of age, and then he got involved with T. O'Brien, Bill Monaghan and the Clancys, all of whom were horse dealing. Steve was an able, if not necessarily dedicated worker. He was also employed for a time as a butcher boy in Oxley for Mr. Gardner. Steve soon ended up working with his father and his siblings, stumping properties, and it wasn't glamorous work, but honest work. As a teenager, Steve was a jockey who'd won a few minor prizes under his belt, including the Benalla Handicap. His small frame and natural affinity with horses made him the perfect fit, and it would come in handy later on when he combined his excellent geographical knowledge of Wangaratta and the Warby Ranges. He was a popular youth, quite likely due to his fun-loving nature and eagerness to please, and it's easy to imagine Steve strutting past O'Brien's hotel with his hat cocked, his chin strap under his nose and a bright sash around his waist, accompanied by the likes of Dan Kelly, Tom Lloyd, John Lloyd, and later on Aaron Sherritt, Joe Byrne and Ned Kelly. They were known as the Greta Mob, and probably around this time Steve would have felt a sense of belonging and was probably more in the mob for socialising rather than work. He seems to have built a strong bond with Dan Kelly during this time, perhaps drawn by the self-assuredness and the natural charisma the younger Kelly seemed to possess. The Kelly boys were seemingly blessed with the ability to leave a favourable impression on almost anyone they met, whilst also projecting a don't mess with me vibe likely forged due to their harsh upbringing. In contrast, Steve's slender build and delicate features likely made him someone who was far from intimidating, so being around someone like Dan would have been a good move to make him tougher by association. The Greta Mob were known in the district as larrikins, and what Steve lacked in physicality he made up for horsemanship. The gang were often fond of showing off their skills on horseback. The first time that Steve Hart's mentioned in the Police Gazette is on the 3rd of January 1876, and his description is Stephen Hart, 17 years of age, 5 foot 7 or 8 inches high, fair complexion and brown hair. On the 7th of July 1877, Steve Hart appears in the Wangaratta Police Court during the General Sessions, charged with stealing a horse from David Green of Glenrowan. Green's grey mare had gone missing, and Sergeant Steele had been tasked with finding the culprit. Going to the Hart property in Wangaratta, Steele interrogated Steve and a lodger named James O'Brien about the horse in the paddock behind them. Steve asked, "What, that grey mare?" Steele pressed the point, and Steve indicated he had been loaned the horse from a man in town. When Steele asked for a name, Steve replied, "Have you a warrant for me? I'll give you no bloody information unless you have." Steele promptly arrested Hart and O'Brien, who had also gotten Dick Hart implicated in a horse theft at the same time. The initial charge of theft was altered to illegally using a horse, and Steve was shortly convicted and sent to Beechworth Jail for 12 months. It's here that he befriended Dan Kelly, who was doing time over an incident at a shop where he'd gotten drunk and broken in. This would have made him a black sheep in his family, so instead of staying at the farm when he was released, he left to find work elsewhere. Rumoured to have been shearing in New South Wales and later working at a sawmill near Mansfield before he joined the Kelly brothers at their gold claim on Bullock Creek. It was honest enough work, and no doubt his body had been bulked up from the hard labour smashing granite with a hammer in Beechworth Jail. The one known photograph of Steve depicts him a slender youth, but descriptions of Steve in 1878 paint a different picture. After Steve's exit from Beechworth Jail and during his time travelling for work, Sergeant Steele had been hounding his family for word on his whereabouts. Steele was convinced that he was off duffing stock with the Kellys and even threatened the Harts that if they didn't tell him exactly where Steve was, they'd be shot. The family had no idea of Steve's whereabouts. When Constable Fitzpatrick was assaulted at the Kelly house in April 1878, Steve was not involved. However, he was reported to have made the decision to stick by his mates, and while working with his father and siblings, he downed his tools, took off declaring, "A short life, but a merry one." This phrase not only summed up the youthful impulsiveness of the adolescent Hart, but became sort of a catchphrase of the Kelly gang later on when the meaning had far more sinister undertones. Steve was with Dan and Ned in October 1878 when a party of police had entered the Wombat Ranges hunting for the two Kellys. On the 26th of October, Ned Kelly led Dan, Steve and Joe Byrne in an assault on the police party. 3 police were killed in the incident, though Steve was not one of the killers. When McIntyre escaped on horseback, Dan Kelly had directed Steve and Joe to catch him. They'd gone a distance into the bush but could not catch up. They fired ineffectually into the bush. No doubt this episode was traumatic for all involved, but for Steve and Joe, who came from comparatively sheltered lives compared to the Kelly brothers, it must have been doubly so. And on the 29th of October 1878, in the Victoria Police Gazette, it says, "The other," and in brackets, man whose name is unknown, is about 19 years of age, stout, has only a few straggling hairs on face with a sinister expression. Stringy Bark Creek saw the gang desperate to escape capture long enough to establish a new base of operations. This is where Steve Hart had his chance to shine, navigating the torrential floodwaters that caused the rivers to swell to insurmountable levels. Steve took the gang into his playground. Crossing a secluded bridge, he took the gang and their horses safely to Hart territory, successfully evading the police search parties. Steve would prove invaluable to the gang in their next undertaking, the robbery of the bank. In the Victoria Police Gazette on the 5th of November 1878, there's another description of Steve. The fourth, name unknown, 19 or 20 years of age, 5 foot 8 inches high, fairish complexion, rather stout, straggling hairs over face, slightly hooked nose, sinister expression. There was a story of Steve Hart dressed as a veiled woman riding side saddle who would ride into towns close to the Strathbogie and Warby Ranges to gather information about the banks. On one of these reconnaissance missions, Steve found the perfect target in the township of Euroa. Disguises were not a necessity for Steve at this stage, as he was the only member of the gang yet to be identified. Steve's role in the bank robbery was straightforward but vital. When Ned and Dan set out for Faithful's Creek, Steve rode ahead on his bay mare. Arriving in town in advance of the others, Steve got a bite to eat while he waited and used the time to assess whether the plan was still viable. When the others arrived, he accompanied Dan around the back, where he went into the bank manager's residence and locked Susie Scott, her mother and children in the parlour, but not before being recognised by Fanny Shaw, who was employed as a general maid for the Scotts. Steve and Fanny were schoolmates, and Steve informed Fanny that he was in the process of robbing the bank before tricking her into joining the family in the parlour. Fanny Shaw's testimony would finally expose the mysterious fourth member of the Kelly gang. In the ashes of the fire from the gang's old clothes was found what was to be believed a woman's bonnet, but was after revealed to be Steve's cabbage tree hat with a fly veil. With the fourth member of the gang finally identified, a description was published in an effort to help the public recognise the miscreant. He's described in the criminal records as 21, 5 foot 6, fresh complexion, brown hair and hazel eyes, and his right leg being injured. Stephen Hart wore dark silk mixture paget coat, light tweed trousers and vest, light felt hat, elastic side boots, cotton shirt and black tie. And this was in December 1878. When the gang were officially declared outlaws, it became much harder to move freely. Steve's reconnaissance missions ended in favour of his sister Etty feeding information back to the gang. When the raid on Jerilderie was decided, the gang crossed into New South Wales in pairs, Ned and Joe heading for the pub where they received intelligence before meeting up with Dan and Steve the next day. Steve's role in the raid seems to have been very much as Ned's attack dog. He was the only gang member to not don a police uniform after the Jerilderie police had been locked in their own cells. When the bank was robbed, it was Steve who found the bank manager Tarleton having a bath and subsequently made to guard him as he dressed. Witnesses in the hotel would describe Steve as seeming very nervous. While Ned was going about his work, Steve stole a watch from Reverend Gribble. The outrage made it to Ned Kelly, who ordered Steve to return the watch, which he did under sufferance. Must have seemed a strange paradox to be an outlawed bushranger but not be allowed to steal from people. Once again, he and Dan performed horse tricks as they left the town after a victorious raid. For months, the gang seemingly disappeared. More detailed descriptions were offered that appeared to do very little to help identify the gang. In February 1879, it says Steve Hart is a small man, small growth of whiskers, dark grey eyes, and appears as though he was on needles and pins, but not at all a frightened look or nervous. And a month later, Steve Hart, about 21 years of age, 5 foot 4 inches high, dark complexion, black hair, short dark hair on both sides of face and chin, bandy legs, stout build, clumsy appearance, speaks very slowly, dressed in a dark paget suit, light felt hat and elastic side boots. And then in November 1879, when seen previous to the police murders, he was a beardless stripling, but now he has grown a long beard and his appearance is so strongly resembling his brother Dick as to be mistaken for him for those who know the latter well. Watch parties were assigned to the Kelly, Hart and Byrne properties to stop them from returning home. During this time, the banks were guarded by men of the garrison artillery, which made future plans for bank robberies impossible to carry out. But by the beginning of 1880, the gang were making appearances again, this time stealing metal to make suits of armour. At Glenrowan on the 28th of June 1880, Steve initially attempted to pull up rails from the train track with Ned, but soon became the attack dog again, keeping prisoners under control while Ned found the men who could lift the rails. Steve's behaviour was typically aggressive, but as he was confined to guarding the women and children in the station master's house, he became bored and took to drinking and even napped on the sofa with his revolvers resting on his chest. Depending on which account you read, at one point either Thomas Curnow helped Steve remove his boots and wash his feet in warm water to alleviate swelling, or Steve ordered some of the women to wash his feet. He was also seen with his head on Jane Jones's lap while he complained of feeling unwell. When Steve tired of being isolated, he took the women and children to the inn to join the rest of the party. When the police train was stopped and firing broke out, Steve seems to have avoided injury. However, later on, witnesses claimed he'd injured his arm. Some witnesses described him as cowering behind the fireplace to avoid gunfire, his initial overconfidence brought about by the armour supplanted by terror. After Joe Burns's death and Ned Kelly's apparent disappearance, Steve was despondent. When the prisoners were allowed to exit the inn, he was overheard asking Dan Kelly, "What shall we do now?" To which the reply was, "I shall tell you directly." Many have interpreted this to indicate a suicide pact. The truth about Steve's cause of death will never be determined. However, his corpse was burned beyond recognition in the fire that destroyed the inn. After the fire, Steve's body was retrieved and Superintendent Sadler made the controversial decision to hand it over to the Hart family. A coffin was quickly procured and the remains placed inside and buried in a clandestine service in the Greater Cemetery next to Dan Kelly in an unmarked grave. Steve's siblings. Ellen Hart was born in Yass in 1852 and she married Arthur O'Leary in Victoria in 1866. They had 7 children and Ellen died at Wangaratta, Victoria on the 20th of January 1924, aged 72. Julia was born in 1855 in Wangaratta. She died in Petersham, New South Wales in November 1935 at the age of 80. Richard, known as Dick, was born in 1856 in Wangaratta and he had a selection near his father. He lived on his father's farm during the Kelly outbreak and was a keen sympathiser of the gang. Dick Hart was at Glenrowan during the siege and is reputed to have seen Constable Johnston rushing up to the Glenrowan Inn to set it on fire and raised his rifle to shoot the policeman. Tom Lloyd, who was with Hart, pushed the gun aside, saying that there'd been enough killing. Dick Hart took charge of his brother's body at the end of the siege, taking it to Maggie Skillings's home, which led to the funeral at Greta on the 29th of June 1880. That evening, the Herald reported that Dick Hart swears that he will head another and stronger gang than that of Ned Kelly. So initially, the second gang that he was procuring was to be with Patsy Byrne, Wild Wright, Jim Kelly and Tom Lloyd. However, he was dissuaded from doing so. Hart escorted Kate Kelly to the trial of Ned Kelly and met with Constable Graham in 1881 when Graham tried to heal some of the wounds created during the Kelly outbreak. In 1887, Dick Hart married Sarah Boderne. Her older brother had married Jane Hart 14 years earlier. Her younger sister was to marry Richard's brother Thomas. Richard and Sarah Hart had 6 children, all born in Wangaratta. In the Melbourne Argus on the 29th of November 1934 was announced Richard's death. At his residence, Albion Hotel, Evans Street, Port Melbourne, Richard Hart, the dearly beloved husband of Sarah Hart, loving father of Richard, William, Dennis, Eric, Leslie, Alphonsus and Hilda, Mrs. Fitzhenry, aged 78 years, late of Wangaratta. The 4th child was Hugh Patrick and he was born at Woodstock in Victoria in 1859. He married Isabella Clancy in 1884. However, in January 1892 it was announced that Mrs. Isabella Hart, wife of Mr. Hugh Hart of Mulwala, New South Wales, died on Thursday at the residence of her mother, Mrs. Clancy, Chancery Lane, Wangaratta. The cause of death was hydatids. This is a parasitic disease, and people can get the disease if they come into contact with dog feces, as it's caused by tapeworm, and it causes cysts to grow in organs, usually your liver. She was 32 years of age and leaves 2 children. And in 1881, it mentions Hugh Hart. It says that Jay McConnell has been committed for trial at Benalla for horse stealing. He is said to have been put up to it by Hugh Hart, a brother of Steve Hart, but this Hart denied in the witness box. And also in 1881, it says Miss Kate Kelly, accompanied by Hugh Hart, a brother of the late outlaw, is in Beechworth and attended the court with the object of attending the trial of her brother. The 5th Hart child was Esther Hart, known as Etty, and she was born on the 14th of March 1861 in Wangaratta. She was rumoured to be a girlfriend of Ned Kelly's. She married John Williams in 1883 in Victoria. They had 2 children, and she passed away on the 28th of November 1928 in Balmain, New South Wales, aged 67. The 6th child, Nicholas Hart, was a jockey, and he was born about 1862. He died at Wagga from inflammation of the lungs, consequent of a heavy cold, acquired while going with Mr. Hoysted to Wagga races in 1876. The 7th child, Teresa Hart, was born in 1865 in Wangaratta and died at the age of 4. The 8th child, Thomas Miles Hart, was born in 1867 at 3 Mile Creek. He married Mary Elizabeth Bodern in 1889. He used to train horses for Mark Whitty, and he also rode several of them at race meetings. They had 6 children, and he died on the 11th of April 1917 in Wangaratta at his residence in Tone Road. He'd been under treatment at St Vincent's Hospital in Melbourne. He returned home at Christmas time and his health did not improve, and he died of a pulmonary complaint. The 9th child, Rachel Hart, was born on the 20th of June 1870 at 3 Mile Creek. She married Thomas Peter Lloyd in Wangaratta on the 6th of September 1899 when she was 29 and Tom 41. Tom Lloyd had been a partner to Margaret, or Maggie, Kelly, one of Ned's sisters. Maggie and Tom had 10 children together, 9 surviving infancy, and then Rachel and Tom had 6 children together. So he was the father of 15 living children. And it says in the paper, a double wedding was celebrated in the Roman Catholic Church, Wangaratta, last week, when Miss Rachel Hart and Miss Agnes B. Hart, daughters of the late Mr. Richard Hart of 3 Mile Wangaratta, were united in the holy bonds of matrimony, the former to Mr. Thomas Lloyd of Greta West, and the latter to Mr. Henry R. Hall, son of Mrs. B. Hall of Wangaratta and foreman of the Dispatch composing staff. In 1917, Tom Lloyd was riding at the Royal Melbourne Show when he had a fall off a horse and fractured his neck, leaving him a part quadriplegic. He lived for another 10 years and died at Greta in August 1927. Rachel died on the 13th of September 1958 at Henty, New South Wales, at the age of 88, and she was buried at Wangaratta Cemetery with her mother. The 10th child, Agnes Bridget Hart, was born in June 1872 in Wangaratta. She married Henry Rufus Hall in September 1899 in the double wedding with her sister Rachel, and she died in Sydney on the 13th of October 1956 at the age of 84. And the 11th child, Harriet Alicia Hart, was born on the 9th of June 1874 at Wangaratta. She married James Joseph O'Brien in 1896. They had 6 children. John served in World War I, and Harriet died in 1942 in Petersham, New South Wales, at the age of 68. So there you are, the story of Stephen Hart, the 4th member of the Kelly Gang.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.